Welcome back. This week on to Chapter 7, talking about considerations for training related to age. So we'll talk both about training considerations for youth and then training considerations for the elderly. And then we'll also talk about training considerations with respect to sex. Do women need to be trained differently than men? As a hint, no. But most of what we know about resistance exercise in terms of most of the foundational knowledge comes from studies of resistance exercise in adult men. And we didn't really see many studies that incorporated women as subjects until the 1990s. Actually, so there's kind of this big gap between the 1960s and the 1990s in terms of women being excluded from studies. And so the reason for that is more than you need to know, but one of the primary drivers of that was an experimental, well, it was ultimately approved medication called thalidomide that resulted in really severe birth defects. And so as a result of thalidomide and as a result of concerns about the implications for including women in your study who might be pregnant or might become pregnant during the course of the study and then things going wrong, women of childbearing age were often largely excluded from studies really beginning in the 1960s, and then that was kind of extrapolated to or expanded to include all women. So from the 60s to the 90s, most studies were done using males as subjects. And then there starts to be this push in the 1990s for more health-related research that includes women as subjects, and so we start to see an increase in that. But again, most of the foundational knowledge that we've gotten about the effects of resistance exercise come from studies on men. So resistance exercise, as you can see the definition there, a specialized method of conditioning whereby an individual is working against a wide range of resistive loads to enhance health, fitness, and performance. So one of the things that the authors want to do here is to point out that resistance exercise, fighting against some sort of resistance, which could be lifting weights, that's kind of traditional resistance exercise, right? But that includes not only like barbells and dumbbells and exercise machines, but that also includes things like kettlebells, sandbags, strongman implements, and obviously includes your own body weight. So that includes things like push-ups, body weight squats, and then TRX training. And then it also includes things like exercise bands, right? So all of those kind of fall under this really expansive rubric of resistance exercise. And that's as opposed to the sport of weightlifting. So if we say weightlifting in one word, if someone is familiar with the nuances of resistance exercise and strength training, when they say weightlifting as one word, they mean the Olympic weight lifts, right? They mean the contested Olympic lifts. And those two contested lifts are the snatch and then the clean and jerk, right? So when we talk about weightlifting, we're talking about snatching and clean and jerk, and then the variants thereof, right? So power clean is a derivative of the clean and jerk, or overhead squats. That's a derivative of the snatch. So weightlifting, one word, refers or should refer to the Olympic lifts, the contested Olympic lifts. Weightlifting, two words, is more of the recreational activity. You going to the weight room and you're doing some squats and some knee extensions and that kind of stuff. That would be weightlifting, two words. So there's a little nuance there. So these first couple slides are a lot of terminology, so let's go. So there's childhood. So childhood is a period of life before the development of secondary sex characteristics. So secondary sex characteristics include things like facial hair, body hair, deepening of the voice in males, development of breast tissue in women, those kinds of things. Those are all your secondary sex characteristics. So childhood is that period of life before puberty, before you start to develop those. Adolescence, the awkward years, is after puberty has started until you reach adulthood, right? And so you're an adolescent at the onset of puberty until you reach one of the ways that adulthood can be, I was going to say quantified, but measured, would be the achievement of skeletal maturity. Once your bones have stopped growing, right, you've reached your skeletal, your physical maturity at that point, which, for women, somewhere around the age of 20, plus or minus a few. For guys, tends to be a little bit older, more around the age of 22, again, plus or minus a few years. So in terms of terminology for this chapter, and for most strength and conditioning literature, when they're talking about youth or youth athletes, that's going to include both children and adolescents. So that means essentially everyone who has not yet reached physical maturity. So again, people below the age of 20 to 22 for the most part. Certainly it means people under 18. So if we talk about youth, that can be pretty expansive and can refer to people under 18. But for these purposes, we're talking about people who've not yet reached physical maturity. Speaking of that, so for these purposes, someone who is a senior or older in strength and conditioning literature, but particularly in this chapter, that refers to men and women over 65 years old. Growth, as you would expect, is the increase in body size or the increase in size of a particular body part. Development, which is a little bit different, is the natural progression from prenatal life to adulthood. And so the sub point there that some improvements in performance are related to development, not to training. One of the things, so in my own son's schooling, they had PE, so he just entered 6th grade during the, what academic year is this, 21-22 academic year. He just entered 6th grade. But prior to this, he was at the elementary school. And at the elementary school, they had PE 2 days a week. And the PE teacher had to measure their performance, I think 3 times a year. And so they do the BEEP test, which is a type of VO2 max test. They do, max out on push-ups and sit-ups and all that kind of stuff. And that always struck me as funny because it wasn't measuring any sort of, training effect, right? They're only doing PE 2 days a week, and most of the time they're doing working on various motor skills. They're playing games that involve kicking, they're playing games that try to develop agility or throwing skills, those kinds of things. So they're not doing things that would develop aerobic capacity and not really doing things that are going to develop strength or muscular endurance, to be honest. But they still had to measure it 3 times a year. And so the reason I thought that was funny is because they were effectively measuring development improvements. They weren't measuring improvements related to any sort of training variable. That would be different if you had them engaged in like really consistent, body weight resistance exercise, or you had them doing some low-level plyometrics or some kind of an endurance training program, and then you did like a pre and post measurement. Well, then you'd be measuring the effects of the training program. Now, the development, of course, is a confounding variable in there. Did they improve a bunch because they just happened to be developing, or did they improve a bunch because you had a really good program? That makes things a little more complicated. But a lot of the improvements that you see during youth and early adolescence are particularly related to just natural course of development rather than to any particular training regimen that's included, unless you're deliberately trying to develop physiological parameters. So again, things like aerobic capacity. Now that said, kids are highly responsive to training, so their performance does improve with training on top of whatever they would have developmentally. So don't let that sound like I'm telling you kids shouldn't train. They absolutely should, and mine does. But again, that development piece becomes sort of a confounder in there, becomes something that can complicate your results. But kids absolutely respond to training, both strength training and endurance training, and can improve their fitness, can improve their body composition, and a lot more things, as we'll talk about on a later slide. Maturity, some of us never reach it. So maturity, the process of becoming mature and fully functional. So in this case, we're talking about physical maturity. Again, something like skeletal maturity, where the bones are done growing, right? So once your epiphyseal plates, your growth plates have closed, then that is the point of skeletal maturity. They're not going to increase in length anymore. They may widen some, depending upon your training status and then different training stimuli, but they're not going to grow in length anymore. You're not going to add any additional height. So that's the point of skeletal maturity. And then puberty, the period of time in which secondary sex characteristics develop and a child transitions to young adulthood. And again, those secondary sex characteristics include things like development of facial hair, deepening of the voice, etc. Chronological versus biological age. I know you've talked about this in at least one previous course. So chronological is time. So chronological age is their age in months or years. So that is saying that your kid or an athlete is 11 years old or an athlete is 8 years old. That's their chronological age. But their biological age can be a little bit different because, as you know, there's a window in terms of early developers or late developers with respect to when kids hit puberty. And so things change during puberty, as we all know. But one of the things that changes is you'll see big increases in the sex hormones, so particularly estrogen in women and girls, and particularly testosterone in boys, right? And so those sex hormones do things that include stimulating growth plates, so they cause the growth spurt, the adolescent growth spurt that we're going to talk about, but they do things like also increase size of muscle mass and a number of other things, right? And so when kids hit that growth spurt, or when kids start to hit puberty, and then you see those increases in testosterone, for example, increase in muscle mass, increase in height, those kinds of things. If you have two kids that are both 12 years old, but one of them has started puberty and is starting to get additional testosterone, muscle mass, and height, that kid is going to be physically different than the kid who has not yet started puberty. And that kid's going to respond to training differently than the kid who hasn't yet started puberty. So as you can see there, the onset of puberty can vary somewhere between the ages of 8 and 13 in girls and 9 and 15 in boys. And so again, that's going to be a differentiator in that age group. And so you can see there in my little picture, I don't know how old these kids are. These are probably like U10s. But you can see, got Andre the Giant over here. So that kid is much, much larger than the other kids. He probably has larger parents, right? So he's probably just from a larger family. But in addition to that, I would suspect, given how much larger he is than all of the rest of the kids, including his own teammates, that he's probably starting to hit that adolescent growth spurt. All right, so biological age then. So if chronological age is just months, years, and days, how old are they? Biological age, again, relates to their level of maturity. So it's measured in terms of skeletal age. So when we say skeletal age, we're looking at, or we can measure their growth plates. And so we can see how close the growth plates are to becoming fused. As the kid ages, they get closer and closer to fusing, and then once you reach skeletal maturity, they become fused, right? So that's skeletal maturity. Somatic, anything somatic is body. So somatic or physique maturity, so with that increase in sex hormones, you get an increase in muscle mass, and so of course that changes their physique, at least on the guy's side. You get an increase in muscle mass. For women, as we'll talk about, you get some increase in muscle mass, but it also changes their fat distribution a little bit. So of course then that would affect their physique as well. And then sexual maturation. A related term, menarche, so that's the onset of menstruation, which is the marker of sexual maturation in girls. For guys, it's not as clear. So on the boys' side, deepening of voice, appearance of facial and pubic hair, those are the primary markers of maturation. Skeletal age, I mentioned a second ago. Again, we can measure that through X-ray by looking at the growth plates. So that's a good way to get an idea of their maturation. That doesn't involve, so there's different scales where you actually look at, where a doctor, not any of us, but where a physician can look at the maturity of the sex organs, can look at the maturity of body hair, those kind of things, and there's a grading scale. I don't know the name of it because, again, it's not something that we would use in strength and conditioning. It's not something that we would use in sports medicine, at least in athletic training, but it is something that a physician could use to measure maturity. However, for those of us that aren't physicians, a good way to measure skeletal age would be related to, in a something that's not related to the sex organs, is looking at skeletal maturity or skeletal age. All right, so as you might suspect, maturation matters. So with that adolescent growth spurt, boys experience what has been termed the neuromuscular spurt and girls don't. The graphic that you see here in the lower right is a measure of vertical jump height. And so the bottom line here is girls pre-puberty, girls post-puberty. And so you can see that the onset of puberty for girls doesn't really affect their muscular power. So vertical jump is a measure of power. So their power output post-puberty is about what it was pre-puberty. For boys, however, there is a big difference. So boys pre-puberty and then post-puberty. So boys get a big increase in muscular power post-puberty. And so the reason for that is, again, so when girls hit puberty and they start to produce more estrogen, the things that estrogen does, it does stimulate the growth plate, so girls grow taller. So that's why, especially kind of during those middle school years, you see those where the girls just like shoot up and the boys kind of lag behind. Again, girls typically hit puberty earlier than boys do, and so girls hit that growth spurt. You get often a pretty dramatic increase in height, but with that increase in height, you get some increase in muscle mass, but not much. you also get an increase in fat mass, so you get a development of the breast tissue, increased storage of fat around the hips and in the lower body. So again, those secondary sex characteristics. And so all of those things are important for maturation and development, but those things don't lend themselves to improved muscular power, right? And so girls actually at the end of, or on the other side of puberty, typically end up with a reduced strength to weight ratio because they've put on more fat mass and they haven't added much more muscle mass. They tend to be a little bit weaker relative to their total body weight after puberty. The other thing is you're going to see a change in the height of center of mass. That's what COM is here. So center of mass is the imaginary point about which all of your body weight is concentrated or balanced. So in girls, it tends to be a little bit below their belly button. In boys, it's right above the belly button, maybe above, depending upon how much upper body muscle mass you have. And so that's a reflection of weight distribution. Girls tend to have a little bit more weight in the lower body. Boys tend to have a little bit more weight in the upper body. And so with girls, one of the things you'll see is during that adolescent growth spurt, as they're adding additional fat mass, and as they grow quite a bit taller oftentimes, you'll see where their center of mass will shoot up quite a bit. And so they get this increased height of the center of mass, but not an increase in muscular strength. And so they become a little bit less good at controlling their center of mass, controlling their body weight. And so that's one of the reasons that we tend to see where girls see a big increase in their risk of ACL tears is kind of right after that growth spurt, because they've added all this height, but they haven't added the muscle mass and they haven't probably done the training to learn how to control that change in their physique, that change in their size. And so because of that, it makes it more likely that they're going to put their knee in a bad position or land wrong and then end up with an ACL sprain. The level of maturation, let's go with that. Level of maturation affects readiness for different training loads. So somebody post-puberty or even in puberty, again, so thinking about boys, if they're producing more testosterone, testosterone's an androgen and it's going to be a stimulator of muscle growth. And so a kid who is producing testosterone, more of that, is going to be more able to adapt and respond to a resistance training program. So they'll see faster improvements in muscle size, faster gains in strength than you would see with someone who was a pre-adolescent. So the more mature they are, the faster they tend to adapt to those training programs. Peak height velocity is the age at maximum rate of growth during the pubertal growth spurt. So the age when they start to hit this really high rate of growth, that's their peak height velocity. And then during that point, for both boys and girls, we can see a potential increased risk of injury. Again, because you're adding this height, but you haven't added enough muscle mass or neuromuscular control, or potentially a combination of the two, to be able to control that new size. And so you can put your ankle, put your knee in the wrong position and get injured. You see this, so thinking back to coaching in high school and middle school, like one of the coaches I worked with would joke about some of the really awkward looking kids that had just had a growth spurt, and he would joke that they look like a newborn horse the way that they ran, because they're just so long limbed and they just can't control their new length, and it's just this really awkward looking run. And so I always thought that was a pretty entertaining description of it. So one way to think about it. So training age then is the length of time an individual has consistently followed a formalized training program. So their training age is, maybe they've been consistently training for 2 years, or if they're new to training at all, then their training age is 0. So why that matters is somebody that has a more advanced training age can do more advanced exercises. They've also made some of the adaptations that they're already going to make, so you're not going to see as big of a proportional increase in their, power, in their muscular strength, those kinds of things. So that's why that matters. In terms of muscle and bone growth, so I touched on some of this stuff. So during puberty, on the boys' side, increases in testosterone, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factors, which are IGFs, in boys result in increased muscle mass, increased muscle strength, and overall body size. The increase in estrogen in girls causes increased height, increased body fat deposition, breast development, and widening of the hips. And so while the girls do get some increase in muscle mass, it's not to the same extent as the boys. And so again, that can lead to some of those neuromuscular control issues related to the knee and ankle. So peak muscle mass occurs between 16 and 20 years old in women and 18 to 25 in men, but those are untrained individuals. So if we affect that with resistance exercise or diet or both, then we can lengthen the time that it takes them to reach peak muscle mass. So for example, this is where sometimes you'll see people, kind of joke about old man strength. Guys in their 30s and potentially even into their 40s can be really, really strong, and in some cases stronger than they were at 25 years old, because it takes a long time to accrue enough muscle proteins, actin and myosin, and to develop the neuromuscular features to be able to express lots and lots of strength. So that's why the highest level strongmen you see tend to be in their late 20s and early 30s. So the really elite strongmen are kind of in that early 30s range. So for them, their peak muscle mass, peak strength is in the early 30s or maybe to mid 30s. So 10 years after it would be had they been untrained. So in terms of muscle and bone growth, one of the questions in there for this chapter I think is not a great question, but it talks about where bone growth occurs. So bone growth in terms of length occurs at the epiphyseal growth or epiphyseal plate, which is the growth plate. And then there's also some growth inside of the joint surface, and then at the apophyseal insertions. So the apophyses we talked about in 201, those are sites of muscle origin or insertion. So for example, your medial epicondyle and your elbow, that big knob on the inside of your elbow, there's an apophysis underneath that landmark in kids and adolescents. So that's a site of bone growth underneath that tendon. That's an apophysis. So that's where bone growth occurs. Bones do increase in diameter, and then that is in the diaphysis. So the question about bone growth, the answer it's looking for is the diaphysis. But be aware that bone growth, primarily in terms of bone length, is going to happen. Increases in bone length are going to happen at the epiphyseal plate, joint surface, and then the apophyses. As mentioned also in 201, so the apophyses and the epiphyses are a relatively weak area of bones in kids. So those are areas that are particularly susceptible to injuries. So more specifically, a couple of the injuries that we talked about. So remember, we talked about Osgood-Schlatter's disease, which is the insertion of the patellar tendon into the tibia where the patellar tendon can pull away a little bit. So that's an apophysitis. And so another one we talked about was Sever's disease, which is where your Achilles inserts into your calcaneus, and it can start to pull away a little bit. Tend to see that in soccer players. Sometimes basketball, but usually it's a soccer thing. That's another type of an apophysitis. Because again, those areas where there's that cartilage, in that case it's hyaline cartilage, that's weaker than ossified tissue, tissue that's fully calcified. And so because of that, they're more likely to get injuries there. Skeletal maturity we talked about. All right, so developmental changes in muscular strength. With increased muscle mass related to development comes increased strength. Sorry, it should be related to development. Comes increased strength. And then strength gains usually come somewhere between 9 months and 14 months after peak weight and height velocity. So after they hit that big growth spurt, within give or take a year, that's when they're going to see some pretty significant strength gains after that. So, while they may look like a newborn horse running around during that peak height velocity phase, about a year after that, so if that happened during their freshman year, sophomore year, they're going to start to see some pretty big increases in muscular strength. So, key point here, because this is on several of the questions in the question bank. So when adolescents hit that growth spurt, you're going to get an increase in muscle mass first. They're going to put on size, but they don't yet know how to control that muscle mass. And so being able to recruit that muscle comes later. So size first, and then effective neuromuscular recruitment second. And so then that's really where you start to see the increases in strength and power. So peak strength is usually attained by age 20 in untrained women, and again, 20 to 30 in untrained men. And as you would expect, peak strength corresponds pretty closely to peak muscle mass. So as you hit peak muscle mass, that's about as strong as you're going to get, especially if you're untrained. And then after that, everything kind of goes downhill, particularly if you're untrained. So your motor neurons, remember we talked a lot about alpha motor neurons, and they're myelinated, meaning they can conduct their electrical signal more quickly. Well, more specifically, meaning that they are surrounded by Schwann cells. And so those Schwann cells, which are a fat wrapping, essentially, they allow the neurons to conduct their signal more quickly. And so we don't reach full myelination until we reach sexual maturation. And so, you hear it said a lot that kids aren't just miniature adults. And from a neuromuscular standpoint, they certainly aren't. They can't recruit their motor units as well as an adult can. And they can't even conduct the electrical signals to recruit those muscle cells as quickly as an adult can because their motor neurons are not fully myelinated. So one of the things you'll see if you work with kids and adolescents, in kids before they hit puberty, boys and girls are pretty similar in terms of their physical ability, right? They're of similar speed, of similar strength, those kinds of things. And then once they hit puberty, that's when you start to hit the differentiator. So again, girls tend to get taller and then lose relative strength, and then boys tend to get taller later and gain muscle mass and gain muscle strength and power. Body types I'm not a huge fan of, but nonetheless, this book does ask about them, and there's questions about them in the test. But I'm not a fan of the concept of body types, I guess I would say. I feel like it's kind of outmoded, and we've kind of moved past this, because this is really big in like the 70s and 80s. But nonetheless, it's still in the test bank, so I should probably mention it. So ectomorphic is on the left there. So somebody who is ectomorphic is slender and tall. Somebody who's mesomorphic is in the middle. So mesomorphic, M means muscular. That always helped me remember that. And so mesomorphs are muscular and lean. And then endomorphs are your rounder people with broader shoulders and broader hips. All right, so resistance training for kids. So resistance training for kids can be safe and is effective provided the exercises are properly taught and properly supervised. So mentioned it a little bit ago, so kids aren't little adults, and you'll see that all the time when people are talking about training kids or around youth sports. So they have differences in their neural development, in their motor recruitment patterns, but also in their heat dissipation. Kids are not as good at distributing heat as we are as adults. And if you're training kids, it's better to underestimate their abilities and to build up, so to go from pretty straightforward, simple exercises and work your way up to more complex exercises than it is to have to go backwards. All right, so you don't want to start with something that's really complex or weights that are really heavy and work down, because then the kid, might perform poorly and just they'll not think that they're very good at this. And self-efficacy, as we'll talk about in the next chapter, believing you can be successful at this is fairly important. But also they might get hurt, right? So if you overload them on a squat and they fall down, potentially they could get hurt, and then they're not going to want to do that anymore. And then also, obviously, they're going to miss some training time. All right, so kids are responsive to training. And the book talks about this quite a bit, because there used to be this belief, certainly into the 80s, that kids, because they hadn't hit puberty yet, they didn't have the testosterone, they didn't have the estrogen, so they couldn't respond to training. They were just physically incapable because hormonally they weren't able to respond to that training stimulus. But we know, of course, the hormonal aspect is certainly a part of the response to training, but there are other aspects of the training as well. So kids do respond to training even pre-puberty. They can make neuromuscular adaptations. So the primary adaptation they're going to make is increased neural recruitment. They get better at recruiting the appropriate muscles in the appropriate order, recruiting those larger motor units, those kinds of things, even if they're not able to add substantial muscle mass. So kids can make gains beyond what they would accrue due to normal development, provided that the intensity and the volume of the training are adequate, right? So if they only do one set, they'll see some improvement, but not as much as they would if they do 2 or potentially 3 sets. So going up a little bit in volume is going to be more beneficial in terms of spurring adaptations than doing just 1 set. So typical strength gains, 30 to 40% in pre-adolescence. And again, they're going to see that primarily through neuromuscular adaptations. They're not going to be able to put on a lot of muscle mass because the androgens are a big part of that. And so if they're not able to produce much of those, then they can't see big increases in hypertrophy. After puberty, though, you'll see bigger increases in muscle mass. Detraining happens in kids too. So if the kid has been engaged in, let's say, a strength training program for several months, if they stop training, they'll lose muscle strength, right? So some of those neuromuscular adaptations will reverse just like they do in adults. So just a diagram that I thought might be helpful from the book. So you can see this androgenic hormone production increases, right at the beginning of adolescence. Then we're going to get, along with that, an increase in body mass. You're going to get a fiber type distribution that happens later in childhood before adolescence kicks in. And then this myelination development up here, the red line. And so then all of those added together lead to increased muscle strength, muscle power, and muscle endurance, and then overall performance. So if kids lift weights, here are some of the possible benefits. So you see increases in muscular strength, power, and endurance, increased bone mineral density, provided the bones are loaded. So again, if you only do lower body exercise, you're not going to see adaptations in the upper body. Strength training may reduce injuries in kids because a stronger muscle then helps to stabilize the joint and hopefully makes ligament injuries, for example, less likely. Psychosocial improvements, so changes in self-esteem. They feel like they're competent. They can do a new thing now. They can perform a bench press. They can perform a squat, those kinds of things. And you can really see some improvements in their self-esteem and their self-efficacy with that. Increased body image, increased feelings of competence. They can also improve their motor skills and sport performance. So one of the things on the neural aspect of it is it's interesting to see kids, when they hit like 10 and 12, where they don't know, many of them don't really know how to go full speed. And then they, are around peers who are a little more developed, a little more mature, and who are faster. And so like by being around them, they sort of learn to hit that fifth gear, if you will, right? They learn to actually go full speed. And so it's an interesting transition where they kind of pick that up and they learn that recruitment pattern because they kind of have to keep up. Decreased fat mass. So even though you're not going to see big changes or big increases in muscle mass, because of the additional exercise, you do see decreases in fat mass. Improved insulin sensitivity. So if the muscles are having to run through more ATP, again, you're going to see similar adaptations. You're going to get more of the glycolytic enzymes, more glycogen, all that kind of stuff. And so then the muscles get more effective at bringing glucose into the muscle cell, which means they're more sensitive to insulin. And then you also get enhanced cardiac function. So the heart becomes a little more efficient. The heart becomes stronger, basically. You're going to see probably an increase in stroke volume as a response to that resistance training. In terms of risks and concerns, so there was, again, into the 80s, there was a concern that if kids lifted weights, it would close their growth plate. And there's no good evidence that happens, right? So the idea was that, well, if you take this kid who's still not done growing and you have them do heavy squats, heavy deadlifts, those kinds of things, relative to their body weight, have them do that kind of heavy lifting, that compression from lifting the weights is going to close their growth plates and then they're going to be short, right? And I can see why kind of intuitively that makes sense, but there's no evidence that actually happens. So don't have to worry about that. And then if we compare the loading of the growth plates and the loading of the bones that happens with a lot of the sports that kids play anyway, soccer, football, where they're sprinting, where they're landing from jumps, where they're landing on one leg, those kinds of things, the loading that the bones and the growth plates experience in a lot of those activities is actually higher than what they're going to get during a weightlifting exercise. So that's just something else to think about. So given that, then lifting is relatively safe. It's certainly no more dangerous than a lot of the sports that kids are playing anyway. Again, things like football and soccer. So when injuries happen in the weight room, typically they're accidents. If we're talking about kids, as you get older, there tends to be more strains and occasionally sprains. But in kids, most of the weight room injuries are accidental. And so it's typically from a lack of supervision. So, they may have poor form. Usually they're, putting on weights and not paying attention. Maybe they didn't put a collar on one side of the barbell when one of their friends was getting ready to do some squats, and so weights fall off. Those kinds of things. Those are usually where you see injuries in the weight room related to kids. So what's the youngest age they can start training? There's no hard and fast rule. So kind of the general guideline is if the kid is ready for other sports, right? So if your kid is ready to play baseball, to play flag football, to play soccer, then they're probably ready to start some training, provided that they are interested in doing it, right? So, you don't want to make them go in and do a whole bunch of body weight squats and push-ups and whatever else. If that's going to be a miserable experience for them, you have to be careful that you don't, it's not a punishment type activity that then is going to cause them to not want to do that later. I don't know about you, but like as an athlete, as a youth, we had to do certain things like bear crawls. And it was one of those things, like we had to do bear crawls so often, I was like, I am never again in my life, after I finish with competitive athletics, I will never again do a bear crawl. And I have stuck with that. But if, your kids then view running as punishment, if they view squats and push-ups and those kinds of things as punishment and don't do them, well then potentially that's going to hamper them down the road when they're trying to do exercise to maintain health, to maintain fitness, those kinds of things. So kids can start lifting and training fairly early, but again, they have to want to do it, right? So if they engage in training, goals should include increasing their muscular strength, increasing their body awareness, promoting interest in physical activity, teaching weight room etiquette, and having fun. So in terms of increasing muscular strength, one of the things I would say is when you're starting kids, let's say you're working with an 8-year-old, when you're starting kids on this type of training, on resistance exercise, on sport training, preparing them for the sport, you focus a lot on body weight stuff early on, right? So we're not going to have them squat the barbell, one, because they're not going to be strong enough, but two, because what we're really trying to do is to help them understand their body, help them with their proprioception, know where they are in space, be able to perform a good squat with their back flat, with their chest up, know where parallel is, right, on a squat. Same kind of thing on push-ups. Oftentimes, having coached some youth sports, watching some of those kids try to do push-ups, they're very like one-arm dominant. If they are right-handed, their right hand on push-ups will just shoot up, and their left hand or left arm is very, very weak. And so we're working on things like symmetry, right? So those are the things you focus on in the early parts of the program. You can do some balance stuff with them, and you can make some of that fun. If they're good with their balance and they're good with squats, maybe you combine both and have them do kind of like a wobble board sort of a squat. So they're still just doing body weight, but it's more proprioceptive kind of stuff. And so you're kind of hitting on both of those top two goals, and you're helping them learn to engage stabilizing muscles like the external rotators of the hip, that kind of stuff. In terms of weight room etiquette, not being in front of somebody while they're lifting, not walking across somebody's line of sight while they're lifting, those kinds of things. Just teaching them how to be in the weight room and how to not distract somebody else who's working. So other areas of concern, quality of instruction. So again, as you can imagine, we're going to focus first on proper technique. So we're going to want to make sure the kid can squat first before we load that squat. So got to be able to do a good body weight squat, and then we'll have them hold a dumbbell, or maybe we'll have them hold some other sort of weighted implement. Or as you can see the kids in this picture, you can have them do something like start with PVC pipe. So because a movement like this, the overhead squats, that's a pretty complicated movement. And I recall seeing high school kids, at a gym I used to go to a while back, who'd roll into the gym, and their program said that their warm-up activity was overhead squats, and they could not do that, and that was the warm-up. And they'd try to gut their way through it, but their overhead squats were terrible. They just didn't have the ankle mobility, they didn't have the shoulder flexibility, all those kinds of things, but they'd still try to do them because that's what was on the program. So, you start with easier exercises first. Make sure they can do a good back squat. Make sure they can do a front squat. Then we'll worry about some overhead stuff, right? So focus on that technique, not competition, not who can lift the most weight. Again, start with an unloaded barbell, broomstick, or PVC pipe, and then we can work our way up to something that's loaded. To track their progression, you can have them do workout logs. You can keep a workout log for them. Kids can max out, so you can do a 1 repetition max with them, and oftentimes they're gonna wanna max out because everybody's interested in how much they can lift, right? Especially kids, they're growing into their body, they just wanna see what they can do. And so oftentimes they're really interested in doing a 1 repetition max, but if they're doing the most weight that they can, you really gotta make sure their form is solid before you allow them to do that. Make sure, if they're gonna see how much they can deadlift, that they can do a normal deadlift with their back flat. And then you can also use predictive equations if you wanted, where you have them lift their 5 repetition max or something similar to that. The caution there is that if that's the most weight they could actually lift 5 times, the fatiguing effect of that can also be problematic. Like, on rep number 5, their form is going to just crumble, and so you got to be careful, make sure you're spotting them closely. So there's the resistance training guidelines in case you need those for the quiz. I went ahead and tried to put the graphics from the book that were relevant into the slideshow. So there's that, and there's a thing on reducing injuries in kids. What about women? So women respond to resistance exercise in a similar fashion to men. It's kind of the short version of this is they see the same relative increases, but not the same absolute increases. So women and men who engage in a resistance training program, at the end of the program, may both increase their strength 20%, but he may have added 20 pounds to his max, whereas she added 10 pounds to her max, right? So they made the same relative increase. They both improved 20%, but the absolute increase for him, because he had a higher starting point, was 20 pounds, and for her was 10 pounds. So there's an absolute difference, but the relative improvement is the same. So on average, adult women tend to have more body fat, less muscle, and lower bone mineral density than adult males. So one of the stats I give out sometimes is that the average college-age male has somewhere around 12 to 15% body fat. So 12 to 15% of their overall weight is fat mass. For women, it's more like 22 to 25%. So again, that starts at puberty because of that hormonal difference between men and women that begins at puberty. You see different body compositions take shape, where women tend to, again, add more fat mass, guys tend to add more muscle mass, and especially guys tend to add more muscle mass in the upper body relative to women. So women also tend to be lighter and smaller, have wider hips, narrower shoulders, and if women have extremely low body fat percentages, that may be associated with adverse health consequences, meaning that there's some evidence that if women have body fat lower than 12% or potentially lower than 14%. Now remember, I just said that typical body fat for a college-age woman somewhere between 22 and 25%. So if women get their body fat down between 14 or lower than 14%, potentially lower than 12%, then you start to see some disruptions of menstrual function. And if you see disruptions of menstrual function, you see alterations in typical estrogen peaks. And estrogen plays a really important role in absorption of calcium in the intestines, but also limiting bone turnover. And so with that disruption of the menstrual cycle, or complete cessation, which is amenorrhea, you see kind of a flatlining of estrogen production. And so estrogen then, if it's not being produced, isn't protecting the bones, and then potentially you could see an earlier onset of osteopenia, which is kind of a bone thinning, and then osteoporosis, which is porous bones, and so then they're more likely to get fractures. So that's the health consequences there. All right, so we talked about absolute and relative measures. So again, women generally have lower absolute strength. So again, a guy may lift 200 pounds, a woman may lift 100 pounds, but that gap narrows when the relative measures are used. So if we norm it to fat-free mass, if we norm it to fat-free mass, that's what FFM stands for, the differences almost disappear. So if we account for the woman's slightly higher body fat percentage, then basically muscle is muscle, right? And so women, again, are equally strong per square inch of muscle area to men, and then typically women respond in the same fashion, right? So I see similar relative strength increases. So I mentioned all this. So the absolute gains in strength are often less for women than men, but relative gains are similar, and we see similar relative gains in muscle mass. But because men tend to start with a higher amount of muscle mass at the beginning, when they add 5% muscle mass, that'd be a huge gain. But when they add 5% muscle mass, that's a much more pronounced, much more noticeable difference than what you would see in a woman, because typically they start with a lower amount of muscle mass. But the improvements or the increases in muscle mass are similar between men and women. Female athlete triad is actually what I was talking about on the last slide. So it's the interrelationships between energy availability, menstrual function, and bone mineral density. So if you have low energy availability, so let's say we have somebody like a female cross-country runner who is running 60 miles a week, and she's just not eating enough. Maybe she's doing that intentionally, maybe she's not. Maybe she has a hectic schedule and she's just not eating enough. Or maybe she's doing it intentionally because the lower your body fat percentage, the higher your strength to weight ratio. And so it's an advantage. You got less fat mass, which is not doing anything. You got to carry throughout the course of a cross-country race, so you're a little bit more economical runner. But for whatever the reason, she has low energy availability, which leads then to that really low body fat percentage. And then again, when the body fat gets too low, then that can lead to menstrual dysfunction, which then affects bone mineral density. So you get this combination of low energy availability leads to low body fat percentage, and low energy availability combined with the high training volume and intensity leads to the menstrual dysfunction, which leads to increased rate of bone turnover, decreased rate of calcium absorption, and then decreased bone mineral density. And so then that's when you see amenorrhea, which is the absence of a menstrual cycle for greater than 3 months. And again, if that continues over the course of several months to years, potentially that could increase their risk of developing osteoporosis at a younger age. All right, so if we're designing strength programs for women, because women respond in a similar fashion to men, there's no real difference to make a women's program any different from a man's, right? So if you've got male and female soccer players, they can both do the same basic program. Now, the one caveat to that is that women, because I use soccer players as an example, women are much more likely to have an ACL tear in soccer than men are. And so you might do some preventive stuff where you're going to do hip abduction exercises, hip external rotation exercises, landing kind of things with your women's team that you wouldn't do as much of with the men's team because of that increased likelihood of ACL tears. So, but in terms of designing the program to improve their performance at soccer, you're still going to use squats, you're still going to use various presses, lunges, those kinds of things. So the program shouldn't differ based on sex, it should differ based on the demands of the sport. Women tend to be a little bit weaker in the upper body, again, because they don't have as much upper body mass, muscle mass. And so because of that, female athletes can benefit from an additional 1 or 2 extra sets relative to the men's program. So that is one of the minor alterations. But where I was going with saying the program shouldn't be different is the women don't have to do lower intensity, high repetition stuff. That was something that was really in vogue really prior to the last 20 years. It was like, okay, if women lift, they don't want to put on too much muscle mass, typically for social reasons. And so because of that, we're just going to have them do like sets of 12 and 15, and then we're going to do relatively light weights, versus we're going to have the guys do like sets of 5, right? Women can do sets of 5 just like the guys can, and they'll make similar training improvements just like the guys would, right? So they'll see similar increases in muscle strength and power. Again, relative, not absolute, but they'll see similar increases in both. As mentioned, women in certain sports, including things like basketball and soccer, potentially lacrosse, handball is a big one. I don't know much about handball, but that's actually one of the big sports where women tear their ACLs. But female athletes in the same sports, so again, if we're looking at soccer players, men's soccer versus women's soccer, female athletes are 6 times more likely to tear their ACL than men. Possible causes there include increased joint laxity. Laxity is looseness. Different limb alignment, so that's that Q angle or knock-kneed alignment, because women tend to have wider hips. Women probably have smaller femoral notches. That's the area where the ACL originates there on the femur, but I don't know. I'm torn on that one because, of course, they have smaller femoral notches. They're smaller. Smaller ligaments, same thing. Different skill level, Hormonal differences, not a big fan of that theory. Training deficiencies, possibly, because sometimes it's harder to get women or female athletes to buy into a weight program. Not always, certainly, but sometimes it is. And so there may be some training differences where it's not necessarily as hard to convince adolescent boys in particular that they need to spend time in the weight room. Sometimes it can be a little more difficult with girls, and so then that can result in some of those training deficiencies in terms of being not as strong. And then again, that's related to neuromuscular deficiencies as well, not being able to recruit the appropriate muscles at the appropriate time and not being able to effectively recruit those type 2 motor units. And if we have Women do ACL prevention programs. There's one, I think it's the FIFA 11. There's one from FIFA that's a soccer program, soccer specific, but it's pretty good for basketball as well if you're working with a basketball team. And it's just a series of exercises geared toward preventing ACL ruptures. So you can find ACL prevention programs out there. Cincinnati Children's Hospital has a pretty good one too if you're searching the internet. And those are pretty good programs. Oftentimes those are kind of used as a warm-up as well, or you can do them like if you're doing station type practice, you can do them as part of the stations, some of the different exercises. So there's a table related to that. Working with older adults. So obviously as we get old, we lose muscle mass and we lose muscle strength. So the way that the loss of muscle mass works is that we start with our fast twitch motor units first. So everything again is use it or lose it. And so we recruit the fast twitch units when we move fast and we lift heavy. And obviously as we age, we tend not to move fast and we tend not to lift heavy, right? I don't have any reason in my activities of daily living where I got to run really fast or generally move fast or to lift anything particularly heavy. It's pretty rare that I have to do those things. And so the only time I would do those is actually in training, or if I was moving to a new house or something, you got to lift some heavy stuff. So because it's so rare, we can sort of do it artificially through training, and by doing that, that helps you hang on to those fibers because you're using them, right? So you tend to lose the fast twitch motor units first. That leads to a decrease in muscle strength and power, and then particularly as people age into their 70s and especially into their 80s and older, not only do those muscle fibers go away, but then the muscle gets more infiltrated with fat, and that's sarcopenia. So people lose really significant amounts of strength, and so that's where you see somebody who has sarcopenia, even though their limb may not look small, the muscles have shrunken a lot and now are infiltrated with fat, and so in that scenario, they experience a pretty significant reduction in strength, and so now they're more likely to fall, their balance isn't as good, and so they're more likely to be injured. We see increased fat mass because with decreases in muscle mass, that decreases your basal metabolic rate, which is the amount of calories you burn just sitting around. And so if their caloric intake stays the same, they're burning less calories just sitting around, so that means you're going to put on additional fat mass if you're consuming the same amount of calories. We also see decreased bone mineral density. So osteopenia is bone mineral density 1 to 2.5 standard deviations below the young adult mean or average. Osteoporosis is bone mineral density more than 2.5 standard deviations below adult average or mean. And with both of those things, with reduced bone mineral density, but particularly with osteoporosis, you see an increased risk of fractures and falls. So sometimes the fractures, like let's say in the neck of the femur, can lead to the fall, or sometimes if they fall, when they try to catch themselves, that can result in the fracture. So as mentioned, seniors are at increased risk of falls due to decreased strength because they've lost the larger motor units, decreased power, same reason, decreased reaction time, same reason, but also some central nervous system changes with age as well. And then that leads to impaired balance and postural stability, making them more likely to fall. And so exercise programs for older adults should then focus on resistance training to increase muscle strength, but also balance training to reduce the likelihood of falls. And musculoskeletal system can continue to adapt across the lifespan, so older adults can still see increases in muscular strength. They can still see changes in neuromuscular recruitment. They don't tend to see as big of increases in muscle mass, as you know. Again, partly related to hormones, but they can still increase their muscle mass a little bit, and they can still increase their strength relatively quite a lot. Because, as you can see there, seniors are typically very deconditioned. They often haven't done very much for a very long time, and so with that, they can see really big improvements in strength, just basically from going from not doing anything to doing something will result in some pretty big improvements in strength. So that can increase lean mass and improve resting metabolic rate. And then resistance exercise has a positive effect on bone health. It can increase bone mineral density. So in terms of considerations for older adults, again, an important adjunct to cardiovascular exercise, because oftentimes if older people exercise, it's going to be cardio stuff, primarily walking. And that's great. That helps, use calories. That helps keep their insulin sensitivity a little bit higher, keep body weight off or keep body fat off, those kinds of things. And that's all great. But, if their primary exercise is to walk, well, that doesn't do anything for the upper body, right? So you're going to see some pretty significant losses of muscle mass in the upper body if we don't do some resistance exercise for the upper body. So that resistance exercise can help adults maintain independence for longer. As you can imagine, if you're working with older adults, make sure you pay attention to their pre-existing medical conditions, things like previous cardiovascular events, prior training history and nutritional status, and then make sure they complete a medical evaluation before they start training with you. Avoid the Valsalva maneuver. That is when that's when you take a big deep breath and hold it. So, people do that when they're doing the big lifts like squats and deadlifts. You take a big deep breath and hold it to stabilize the spine. But we have to be more careful about that with the elderly because if you hold your breath too long, as you can imagine, tends to lead to lightheadedness. And if you already have balance issues, then that's extra problematic. So we want to make sure that older people especially avoid doing a Valsalva maneuver while lifting. So they breathe out on the concentric phase, breathe in during the eccentric. And then in terms of proper progression, so one of the things as you age, you don't recover as fast. That's kind of a key takeaway there. And so you're going to have longer times between workouts, but you also start with lower volume. So one of the things you'll do if you're working with an older adult is definitely only start with one set, and you may do 5 exercises, maybe a couple more, but probably only like 5. And that's going to make them sore, and it's going to take them a good week to recover. And so you don't want to increase the intensity or the volume very fast, so you see slower progressions. But yeah, because of that decreased ability to recover, you just see longer intervals between the workouts. So typically, resistance exercise recommendations for the elderly are 2 times a week. Now that said, the resistance exercise recommendations for everybody to maintain health is actually 2 times a week of total body exercise anyway. And then make sure they're getting adequate protein intake because people tend to reduce their protein intake as they get older. You just don't eat as much meat. And so unless you've got other sources like dairy or nuts or soybeans or whatever, they're probably not hitting their protein intake, not getting sufficient protein to be able to adapt to the training stimulus. Safety recommendations, and then a summary of the effects of aging and resistance training. And that's it. That went longer than I intended. Sorry about that. So that's the end of 7, and then we'll move on to 8 next time, which is psychological factors. So we'll see you then.